gave me the task of talking about forage options after small grain harvest, and my first thought is, boy, that's the easy one, right? There's so many opportunities for forage production after small grain harvest. A lot of what I work in right now is fitting them into corn silage or corn and bean systems. So this is the one that, to me, has the greatest opportunity in terms of you have options for warm seasons, you have options to go with cool seasons. So today I'm going to really talk about some of those decisions about what you plant and the pluses and minuses. It's all judgment calls. There's a lot of different reasons to do different things. There is no one right answer. And that's typically the way things really are, is there's really not a right answer. It's what fits for what you're trying to do. So I'm going to talk about the options for forage, and really, to me, you break them down into two categories. And the first category is these warm seasons, and we have those opportunities after harvest of, let's say, wheat or oats, or even if you're doing rye or triticale for seed. And sorghum Sudan's probably one of the most common that's utilized. It's a very high forage productivity, and it can be grazed, but it's often one that's used for hay. There's some challenges, though, with trying to get hay production after you harvest wheat or oats, because you're really looking into those fall conditions, and a lot of times you're not going to get it to dry down. Although if that's something that's really a goal of yours, then doing something like a German or foxtail millet may actually make sense. It's one of the times that I typically don't like German or foxtail millet, because you have such a nice long growing season left, and they really mature in about 45 to 60 days. But they mature in 45 to 60 days, so you can get a hay crop off of them, and they're also smaller stem. So you're giving up yield, but you can also gain a hay production. To me, I like to think about, I'm a cow-calf or stocker type mindset, and so for cow-calf producers, well, I'll use the full growing season, plant something like a sorghum Sudan, wait until November, and then I'll graze the standing sorghum Sudan, or even windrow it and graze windrows. If I do that, I'll probably increase my grazing efficiency. So it's all about goals, right? All about opportunities and goals. Sorghum I have in here, and in my opinion, the only opportunity for sorghum is for silage. Sorghum doesn't do as well with grazing. It's way too thick stalk, of course, for hay. So if you're really looking for a forage, for ensiling, then sorghum could be an option. It's really hard to get it to dry down. You're probably going to have to wait until actually after it gets frosted to get it dried down enough. So I still would even do a sorghum Sudan for that particular option. So I kind of have them listed just in alphabetical, or not even alphabetical order, but they're really in a random assortment here. So the difference between Sudan grass and sorghum Sudan, in my opinion, you're going to get more yield out of the hybrid. That's kind of typical, right? We talk about crossbreeding in cattle, we get a better productivity. Well, this is crossbreeding in forages. Sorghum Sudan is a hybrid. It is more productive, but Sudan grass does a much better job of regrowth after grazing. So if I wanted to graze in season, like let's say I'm going to plant in July, and then about, let's say, the first or middle of August, I wanted to do a grazing, I'm going to get more regrowth out of Sudan grass than I would out of sorghum Sudan. So I could get another grazing later in the season, like essentially after a frost kills. If I really like it for really that early planting, if that was going to be your crop rather than something else, right? So I'm going to plant Sudan grass. Maybe I'm going to do 3 or 4 grazings, and then I'm going to plant the cool season. That's where I really like it, because you make up a lot of opportunity with that regrowth. Yes, ma'am.
Although I know that cows never read the manual, does grazing height, how much difference does that make between the two on regrowth?
So grazing height has a huge impact. That's a great question. Has a huge impact on regrowth. The challenge is that with sorghum Sudan, even if I graze it let's say what we typically tell you to wait until 2 feet. 1.5 at the very minimum. And the reason why we tell you not to graze it any sooner is that actually those are both prussic acid producers, right? And so they'll have that toxin in there when they're really short. And so you actually have to let them grow out of it a bit. And so if you were to graze it at that height though, and graze it down, and I mean graze it hard, you'll actually get really good regrowth. Where we have a challenge is if it gets away from you a little bit and you get some stem on it, they don't want to graze the stem, and so they graze off the leaves, and then what it does is it spits out these little spindly leaves out of the stem, and your regrowth is worthless. I mean, you don't get very much out of it. And so if you can manage sorghum Sudan right, you can get some good regrowth. To me, if I'm looking at these shorter season, I'm probably going to go with Sudan, and then if I do mess up a little bit, it's not that big of a deal.
So if you mess up and if you don't graze it down like that, should you mow it low?
You can try because you want it to stool. That's what you want it to do. But I think you'd have a really hard time getting it mowed close enough to actually get it to stool. So it's a great question. The other option, and the only one I wanted to point out that I have on this list that's another option to think about is pearl millet. And the reason I think about pearl millet, it's probably going to yield less than sorghum Sudan, but the huge benefit of pearl millet is it does not produce prussic acid. And especially if you're wanting to wait and start grazing, let's say in September, for you guys thinking about, how many of you from Minnesota? Okay, the majority of you, right? You can have that random frost, right? And after a frost, you have to be off of the sorghum Sudans or the Sudan grass for 7 days. After the first killing frost, you want to get off of it. If it's a mild frost, you'll get some prussic acid production, and you definitely don't want to get back on there until after the killing frost. So it can really make you have to delay your grazing. Pearl millet doesn't do that, so you can be on there the whole time. Yield's a little lower, but that's the advantage, right? So everything has pluses and minuses. Okay, now I talked a lot about these opportunities with warm seasons, and I'll show you some data. Warm seasons are going to be the higher yielders if you can get them in on time. And so on time for us, that would be before August 1st. I'd still probably plant them. The further north you get, like right here, that's actually probably 10 days sooner. And so I'm going to get my best yield out of these warm seasons really in the 20th of July. Does that make sense to everybody? So I'm still in that window though. For us, we might even go down into August 10th. And then for you, it would be August 1st. That's my drop dead date, right? And the further north you go, I'd probably delay it even further. I didn't look at growing degree days even further north in Minnesota. I'm sorry. I should have. But compared to here, I would say this is really, if I'm getting in before July 20th, definitely going to go with the warm season. So if I can get my straw off, if you're going to do straw, if I'm going to put manure on, if you can get your manure on and you can get it planted, that's what I would think about going with. Forage quality wise, because that season's still fairly short, you're going to get fairly good quality, and so your nutritive value between this and this isn't going to be nearly as much. Cool seasons, and you can ignore these, because to me, if I have a small cereal, I can get fall growth. And the winter sensitive ones are going to yield much more in the fall than the winter hardy ones will. So I'm going to go ahead and plant a winter sensitive, whether it's going to be the warm season, if I can get it in early enough, and if I can't, let's say, man, I just got behind because I had too much acres to harvest and I didn't think about paying somebody to come plant, which may be an option. That may be worth it. I'll show you why I think that in a minute. I would go with cool seasons. The other reason I might go with cool seasons is if you are thinking about growing calves, right? Backgrounding calves, maybe I'm gonna wean my calves, let's say October, mid-October, the end of October, and I want to graze them into January and February, and then sell them when the prices typically are high again, right? Because that's the slump, right? When everybody weans their spring cows, that's when the calf prices are slumped. This is a way to kind of play the market, and we can get some really good gains. If I was going to do that, I would not plant these. I would delay and plant these. And within the winter sensitive, the ones I have on here are ones that I think have some good forage potential. In my opinion, oats and spring triticale are probably the two I would use most commonly. We use a lot of oats. There's a lot of differences in productivity between species, but also just between varieties within species. Right, so I can't tell you that oats are always going to be better because there's some really great varieties of spring triticale out there. There's some really poor varieties of oats in terms of forage production. Some fit your system and your conditions better than others. But I can talk to you a little bit about a lot of grasses for yield, and the reason is because they're king in terms of yield. And yield's probably the major determinant of what forage I'm going to plant. Quite frankly, with the timing of planting, quality is going to be pretty good. So it's all about yield, in my opinion. Now, I have a couple of other opportunities on here. I think annual rye, in my opinion, it's never going to yield as well as the small cereals are. So I'm probably not going to plant that unless there's some reason why I can't drill and I want to do some broadcast seeding. There may be some benefits to using an annual rye, but honestly, I think we're going to go on with these because that's where your opportunity is. It's where it lies.
Mary, you mean annual ryegrass?
Yes, annual ryegrass. Yes, correct. So annual ryegrass and cereal rye should have grass on there. My bad. Yeah. Okay, there's the first mistake you caught me in. Now let's see how many more you can get. It's fun. I love my job.
I just want to know.
No.
I'm not trying to
That was not. I was not trying to. This is an important distinction. I hear a lot of people, and you never know if they're talking about rye or cereal rye, right? They're talking about ryegrass. You're talking about cereal rye. What are you talking about? It's extremely important. But I was going to talk about in my research. A lot of times I make mistakes. Those are when I learn, and often I realize I wouldn't do that again. So hopefully I do that, and then I can tell you what I did wrong. So a lot of times I talk about all the things I did wrong, and I'm sure that many of the producers in my state think, why are we paying you? Right? Okay, so I did want to mention the brassicas just for a minute. I really think when we're talking about summer seeding, especially a little bit later summer seeding, brassicas are a great opportunity. They're cheap in terms of seed. Feed quality is extremely high, and yields are really good. So I actually like to have a brassica in with my cool seasons if I'm going to be thinking about grazing some calves. And I actually just recently finished up a second year of a study where we were adding rapeseed in with oats, and we actually were getting a boost in the performance of those calves, about 0.2 of a pound, but I also reduced my seed cost by $5 an acre. And what was really intriguing to me, yield-wise, there was no difference. The most intriguing part was we actually saw some quality grade improvements in those calves that were finished, that had access to the field with the rapeseed. So it was about 30% rapeseed on a dry matter basis. It was 3 pounds of rapeseed and 50 pounds of oats compared to 100 pounds of oat monoculture. I still don't know what's going on. The first year that we got the quality grade boost, I said that's a fluke, because there's plenty of data that suggests that what we feed them during that backgrounding period really doesn't have that much of an impact on quality grade of the calf unless we're really retarding growth. And I mean, these calves were gaining 2 pounds a day on the oats and a little bit more on the oat plus brassica, so that's not what's going on. It's high sugar, but the data doesn't suggest feeding starch improves marbling, so I don't know why we got better marbling. I still am baffled. But that was kind of intriguing. The biggest thing to me is high quality forage, good yield, low price. Why not? That's kind of how I go. All right, so first thing to consider is planting date. These are my suggested planting dates for Nebraska. Like I said, if I was in southern Minnesota here, I would back those up 10 days. So to me, August 1st, your drop dead date on warm seasons. On the winter cool seasons, I would go from that September 1 date to August 20th. And after August 20th, you're way too late, go with winter hardy. We actually have some interesting data where we were planting oats on September 1st in corn silage, and then 2 weeks later we went to high moisture corn and we planted oats. 2 weeks. We went from 1.5 tons of forage to 500 pounds an acre of forage. Those 2 weeks are huge in terms of the amount of productivity. So don't fudge on the dates, right? Don't think, oh, I'll just push it a little bit farther. I think these are pushed as far as I would go. This website, essentially, if you go to our beef website, you can find annual forage planting guidelines. We do have seeding rate guidelines. We do have planting date guidelines. We also have essentially forages, like I was talking about before, ranked based off of quality and yield. And so essentially you can get our recommendations there. Okay, so as a scientist, I love to give you all kinds of data, but hopefully I can make it make sense. So this is yield, and essentially this is 1 ton, 2 ton, 3 ton, 4 ton of dry matter. And these are 2 planting dates. This is in Mead, Nebraska, so it would be about the same parallel as Ames, actually, Iowa, if you think about it that way. And July 22nd, these are the warm seasons, right? So we have sorghum sudan, we have pearl millet, cowpea, and soybean. And then we compared them to our cool seasons here. We got spring oats, spring triticale, spring barley, and spring pea. So the first thing you see is this July 20th, who's clearly the winner, right? Warm seasons, like I said, warm seasons make a lot of sense. And our grasses are going to produce essentially about twice as much as legumes, especially if we look at the cost. These were seeded to where they had the same number of seeds per acre, if that makes sense. So this is about $40 an acre. This is about $20 an acre, right? And I get half the productivity. Now you go, well, I'm going to get some nitrogen out of the deal. And indeed, these are about 20% crude protein, and I'm sure there's some nitrogen in the soil, but these were still high enough for my dry cow in the fall. And so they were still looking at about 15 when we harvested them. This is in the 1st of November harvest, so it's essentially full season growth. And you can see that our cool seasons didn't grow nearly as well, right? They're only a little less than a ton. It was hot. They don't do so well in heat. And then if we go essentially about a month later, so this is August 16th, and we look at our yields, none of these are actually statistically different. You can see the sorghum sudan and the pearl millet did fairly well. This year was actually an abnormally warm year for us. We actually had a very warm fall. And so these guys actually suffered a little bit more than normal. They only got a little bit over a ton on the spring barley. We actually had some rust in our oats. We got a variety of oats that was pretty rust susceptible. That's a whole nother scenario. But I would say these really aren't all that different from each other. But you can see that yield potential out of these warm seasons really fell off, right? And here's my point. My point is I can't count on me having a really nice warm fall like we did this particular year. I would not suggest planting these at this point. These guys are going to yield this way or better. If it cooled down a little bit, actually, I think they would have yielded better.
And so if you were looking at southern Minnesota, you'd say August 6th?
Yeah, I'd say, that would have been equivalent to your August 6th planting in that particular year. And that would have been a really warm year for you guys as well, right? So to me, that's that August 1st date. I probably wouldn't plant warm season even then. Like I said, that July 20th is probably my drop dead date. And this is the in vitro dry matter digestibility. all you gotta think of is think of TDN. So think of energy, right? So the TDN requirement of a cow who's not lactating is about 50. Calf, if I want them to gain, let's say 2 pounds a day, I'm probably looking for 65 to 70 percent TDN. So here's 60, here's 70. So this is a dry cow requirement, right? This is probably what I'm looking for a calf, right? Gain 2 pounds a day. So as you can see, look at how high all of these are. The only ones that got lower than even my calf's requirement, right, are these sorghum, sudan, and pearl millet. They're still fairly good. They're still in the 60s. How many of you get a hay that's in the 60s, right? I mean, a lot of, like, let's say you go and get brome grass hay that's cow feed, it's probably 55, quite frankly. So this is still really good. It looks low because you're comparing it to some really good feeds. But, like I said, I probably wouldn't plant these for a growing calf that I was going to be trying to graze in October because the quality is going to go down a little bit more. But I do think that they're pretty good feed, and they're definitely fine for a dry cow. They're fine even for, let's say, you got a second, a 2-year-old who's still growing. That's still about what you were shooting for her as well. So good feed stuff, just probably not for my growing calf. I'm probably gonna plant some of these. And then as you can see, the later planting, your quality is gonna be a little bit better. And you can see it's probably, this is about 65 to 70. It's still pretty good, but remember we lost a lot of yield, right? So the point here is that all of these annuals are very good feed stuff. I didn't put the protein on here, and I should have. The proteins all ran, I think at the lowest, these guys ran about 12 to 13 at this point in time. So even with that yield, which if you remember, look at this yield. 6 tons, right? 6 tons of dry matter an acre. Heck, that's pretty good stuff, right? We can definitely make that pencil out. And then the pearl millet was a little bit lower, and that's probably typical. About 5 ton an acre it's pretty good. That was actually a really good year. Like I said, it was pretty warm.
So to get those yields, what was your fertilizer program?
So we put on these, we put on 40 pounds of N. That's all we put on.
Across the board and everything?
Everything.
Both plantings?
Yeah, everything got 40 pounds of N at planting. And that includes these guys. They got N as well, just because they were small plots, so it wasn't.
And the year before, what were those plots?
Those were in another annual, so they all came out of turnip and oats. So they had turnip and oats, and the turnip and oats got, I think, maybe 60 in that spring. And they were mixes of turnip and oats, so they're just different
Ratios.
Ratios, because we were looking at, and I think if I remember correctly, we distributed them equally across those plots, if that makes sense. So we balanced for that previous treatment. You know, scientists and all. Okay, so just to re-emphasize my point about sorghum, sudan, and sudan grass are kind of in my opinion, they're really great yielders if I'm going to go early. Really the difference in which one I pick just depends on whether I want to graze and get regrowth or not. Pearl millet is a great option. You're going to give up some yield, but you'll also gain the flexibility to graze over the frost period. This is my teaching style, right? I repeat.
So would some of that change with soil type? Because pearl millet tends to perform a little better in coarse textured soils, and sorghum sudans and heavier soils. So
yes.
Flip-flops there in production based on soil?
I think these two come closer together, like you said, in a finer textured soil, but I'm not sure they'd flip. I'm not sure that we quite get that far. And then, like I said, foxtail or German millet, you're going to give up quite a bit of yield, but fine stem, and you can get a second hay crop if you need a second hay crop. I personally have not played a lot with teff. This is actually some data from one of our other agronomists, and you can see they had yields that were maybe about what the foxtail millet was. Again, I think there's some people who really like teff. They really like it for horse feed. Honestly, if I was going to plant something, it's probably not going to be teff. It's kind of picky about planting conditions, and that's the challenge with it. So to me, some of these other ones are a little bit more foolproof. And that's an opinion, so I don't want to go too far on those. I hit the wrong button. All right. I did want to mention just a minute about if I'm going to be planting these cool seasons. So let's say I am going to shoot for calf feed or lactating cow feed, if I have fall calving cows. And I'm going to plant, let's say, August 1st or even into August 15th. There is a little bit of variability based off of what oat I plant. And I have these two up here. Don't really worry about the variety. Worry about this is an early maturing oat and this is a late maturing oat. And then what I have growing degree days. And the only thing you really need to think about, this is a later planting, this is an earlier planting. So this is more like August 1st. This is more like planting, say, August 15th. Okay? Everybody kind of got that in their head? And then don't worry about all these. We don't need to worry about those. Look at TDNs. So if you look at TDNs and you look at the early maturing, anybody notice a difference compared to the late? I didn't give any equality up with the late maturing with the earlier planting, and indeed I'll actually get more yield with the earlier planting. But with the early maturing, I do. So if you were in the session earlier today when Jim was talking, and he was talking about how that because the growing conditions are such, we're planting a spring oat, right? And the growing conditions in the fall they're cooling, not heating up, right? They're cooling down. Well, it keeps thinking, right? I'm going to go to maturity at some point. I'm going to shoot out the seed head. What happens is it's still warm enough, early enough for this oat often to start to produce that stem and start to think about going to maturity. Whereas it's still, it's too late by the time this would even think about it to even do that. So what we get is we gain some forage quality and some flexibility by planting a forage oat if I want to plant early. So those forage oats, that all they really are is late maturing oats. And so in my mind, the later I plant, the less it matters. The earlier I plant, the more it matters to think about doing a forage type oat. In the spring, there's a huge difference. In the spring, yes, thinking about forage type oat gives you some more flexibility, that window of when you're going to harvest, those type of things. It makes a lot of sense. After corn silage, for instance, for us, the early harvested corn silage, I'm going to go with a mid-maturity oat, and it's fine. It's easy to get a hold of. I'm not going to get any added value out of forage type oats. They're usually a little bit more expensive. I'm not going to waste my time or money. But after a small cereal grain, when I can get it in August 1st, I'm going to go with a longer season oat variety. You guys can talk to your local extension people about what variety works in your area. Okay, I wanted to mention just a little bit about nutritive value of the brassicas. I talked about low seed cost, talked about high quality. What does high quality mean? So what I have here is these were planted essentially early August. This is pretty southeast Nebraska. So this would be probably like planting July 15th, July 20th up here. And what I have radish, leaves, and root, and this is the Daikon oilseed radish. This is just what some of our producers were planting. I went and took samples out of some fields. We've got turnips, leaves, and root, and then we have oats over here. So what I wanted to show you is comparing these. They got 50 pounds of N. Here it is, 50 pounds of N per acre after wheat harvest. And you can see protein content. Brassicas are really great nitrogen scavengers, which can be good and bad, right? If I want to take it up, it's good. High crude protein, right? 18 to 13%. I mean, if you think about what I might be looking for in a cow diet, I have to be a dry cow, 8% crude protein, a lactating cow, really probably 11 to 12, right? So these are really good stuff. It's a lot of ruminally degradable protein. We can talk about that as well. And you can see the oat didn't do quite as good. This is pretty consistent. The oat doesn't take up as much nitrogen, about 9 or 10. That's still fairly high, right? It's still pretty good. Most of your hays aren't going to look that good, grass hays. The one thing I do want to point out, though, because they're such great nitrogen scavengers, that also means they're usually high in nitrates. So if you go and test them, you're going to go, whoa, what do I do? Because most of the time they're going to test to be above what the recommended feeding levels are. We've grazed a lot of radish, turnip, oat mixes. Never had a problem. The mix itself will come up 6,000 to 8,000 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. The recommendations say 2,100. Don't feed it. We could talk a lot about why we probably don't have as much of a problem grazing. Harvesting is a different story, but I think we don't need to worry about it as much with the brassicas because they're so high quality, because we have so much sugar in them. Look at that, 12 to 17 in just the leaves. Those are huge, right? Water-soluble carbohydrates, and then the roots are even higher. They're in the 20s. Now, the other challenge with them actually is this: sulfur contents. They're really high in sulfur. Actually, that's some of the lower values that I've seen. The sulfur content can be a problem if they're grazing something that's only a brassica. That's why we actually want to grass in there. That's why I like to have at least about 50% of the full seeding rate of the grass in the mix if I'm going to put brassicas in, because I want some more NDF, 60% NDF here versus 20 here. Sulfur is more toxic when we have a low NDF situation, and it's because of the pH in the rumen. We want the pH in the rumen to be higher when we have a lot of sulfur, because they produce less hydrogen sulfide, we have less toxicity. Put a little more NDF in the diet, we bring the rumen pH up. So I like to do no less than 50% oat in the mix, and the later I plant, the more oat I probably plant in the mix, the less brassica, because they're going to start dropping off in NDF. Does that make sense? This is pretty early planting, and I got to 60 NDF. That's probably good, 50-50. I'd be okay with that. The other one I wanted to show you, look at these TDN values. 80% TDN. Anybody know what we say corn is in a forage-based diet? It's about 83. 81, 82 for the leaves. The leaves, guys. Not the bulbs, right? It's like a concentrate. It's like corn. I mean, it doesn't have as much starch, right? And you could think about simple sugars, right? We're not that high in simple sugars. Corn's about 70% starch, right? And we're only in the 20s. But what it doesn't have a lot of fiber in it. So it's actually, there's some pectins and some other things in there that are really highly digestible, right? And they disappear very quickly. It's more like a concentrate, and indeed in digestion studies where they add brassicas into, let's say, a grass hay diet, you'll actually see the same response that you would see with feeding corn. So to me, this is like an energy supplement and a protein supplement mixed together. It's a great additive, but I wouldn't feed it 100%, right? You wouldn't put a cow and you wouldn't give her a diet that's just corn without adapting her to it, right? So the same idea. We don't want to go too far on the brassica side, but I really do like them. Okay, I want to talk just a second about types of turnips and types of brassicas. And the big reason I want to talk about these is there's some big price differences. And in particular, if you look at, let's say, kind of the globe type purple top turnip, it's probably what most of you are familiar with, they're a lot cheaper than the hybrids or the forage type that produce more leaf, less bulb. and depending on what, this is a Winifred, this is Pasha right here, and they're producing a lot more leaf. Okay, I showed you the quality. The quality of the leaf's pretty good. The quality of the bulb's pretty good. So why would I choose one over the other? Well, to me, the only difference is if I'm trying to graze and have multiple grazings and I have a full season, there may be some advantages to going with a leafier type. These guys tend to get dislodged sometimes with grazing, right? You have that bulb and they'll knock it and then you don't get regrowth. Or they damage it with their hoof and you don't get as much regrowth. You can get some, and depending on how early you graze it, it's less susceptible to that than others. However, we can get rid of the whole debate right now because rapeseed acts a lot like Winifred, and it's $1 a pound at the moment. Well, we solved that problem, right? Honestly, the earlier you plant, the more I would go towards a leafier type because these guys are like 60-day maturing. So they really, once you get 60 days of good growth, they're not going to grow as much. So if we look at yields, actually, I think I might have that data on here. Ah, I do. Look at that. It's a surprise face. You ever see your professors having a surprise face? What's the next slide? So if we look at the brassicas, this is actually some data out of Colorado. But what I did is I essentially took the growing degree days that they had and essentially pocketed them into what we would be seeing. So for you guys, it would be more like here. For us, it'd be here, if that makes sense, on their planting dates. So the green is the earliest planting date, the blue is the middle planting date, and then this is the really late planting date. This, by the way, is some extremely high nitrogen. If I remember correctly, they put like 100 pounds of nitrogen on this. So they were wanting to make sure nitrogen was not limiting growth. I think they achieved that goal. I would not want to know what the nitrates were on these, but here's the point. The point is, okay, this is purple top. This is Winifred and Hunter. These are two Forage hybrids. This is just a rapeseed. Then we have kale, which is also kind of a short maturity. And then they have two grazing radishes, and they compared it to a triticale. But what you notice is with the early planting, there's some that stand out, and the later planting, they all kind of cluster together. Does that make sense? So if you look at this radish, the rape, and then say Winifred, for instance, right? They're like, oh, I got some extra yield out of them. I mean, I got 2 to 3 tons extra out of them, right? With the early planting compared to the purple top. And it's because they're like more like 90-day maturing. So makes sense. They grew an extra 90 or an extra 30 days. With the early planting, the later we planted, the more time started limiting how much they grew. So this is not atypical. You can see this in a lot of different studies. The earlier I plant, the more likely I want to go with really rapeseed, in my opinion, at the moment, because it's cheap. I'm all about cheap. I call it frugal. Some other people call me cheap. That's okay. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And if I'm going to graze in season, I really like it because I don't have to worry about dislodging. There's nothing wrong with, sometimes what I say is so exciting, you can't even hold on to a book. There's nothing wrong with purple top turnips. I use it a lot. It used to be the cheapest thing you could find, about $1.60 to $1.80 a pound. 5 pounds is the full seeding rate if I was going to do anything. However, I like to mix it with the grass, so I don't want to go over about 3. But I think right now my go-to is rape, especially if I'm going to plant it earlier, like even after small cereals, but also if I want to do some spring planting for like a forage for grazing, I'd probably do that as well. All right, I have this picture on here, and this was another interesting situation, but this is planted, these were planted, September 1st. November 6th, that's what it looked like, and December 9th, that's what it looked like. So you automatically assume, man, we lost a lot of forage quality, right? This looks horrible. And we put calves out about November 15th, and a little bit before this, I got a call. We got to pull those calves. There's nothing out there. Yeah, no, there's nothing out there. Well, I go out. I mean, the ops guys are like, they're convinced that I'm starving these calves. So I go out and I kind of pull it up, and it's melted down. It's like this tall, right? It has no structure because we planted so late. It doesn't produce a bunch of NDF because it's cooling conditions rather than heating conditions. So, and the brassicas never produce NDF anyways. So these oats, they are all melted down. The brassicas all melted down. I fluff it all up, and I'm like, oh, there's still a lot of forage. And they're like, yeah, but it looks bad. So, long story short, we made a vote on what the calves would gain, and I convinced them we had to leave them out. And every 2 weeks I had to convince them to leave them out, another 2 weeks. And at the end, we had some calves that were in the dry lot being fed a corn silage-based ration. I said, okay, you guys, tell me what they're gaining. Tell me what you think they're gaining here. Everybody was convinced they're going to gain more on the corn silage ration. They were gaining 2.5 on the corn silage ration. These guys gained 2.2. Took forage analysis this time, and in January. I didn't put the data on here, but the difference between that brown ugly stuff, this, and this was still 67% TDN and still 20% crude protein. Crude protein didn't change between the 2 dates. TDN went down from a 75 to a 67, right? Still amazingly good stuff. So color can be deceiving. In this particular instance, don't use color as an indicator of quality, because the truth is that the cell solubles are high in energy, but also that fiber that's there is not highly lignified, so it actually is highly digestible. And so that stuff that's still there is still really good stuff. Okay, so I wanted to just show you just briefly, we had 8 trials, now I could add another few, where we planted either after wheat, after corn silage, or after alfalfa. Last 2 speakers I heard talked about alfalfa in the rotation, and in particular, one was talking about the opportunity on that 4th cutting of that last year, why not kill it and plant something to get some more forage productivity, and that's what we did. Essentially, these were alfalfa that was coming out of the rotation. We round-upped it, and we planted either oats, turnip, and radish, or oats and rapeseed, or oats. And honestly, the farm crew loved it. They said that was the most mellow, the nicest ground they planted into, even though we grazed on all of these for 60 to 90 days in November, December, and January. It was amazing. We did not put nitrogen on these. These we did, and I'll show you that as well. But we're anywhere from, depending on when we get it planted, these are kind of pushing some of these dates, like this one, and what the growing conditions were, we're yielding somewhere around between a ton and 2.5 ton an acre. These 2, in my opinion, we could have got a lot more out of. There's a couple things that were done wrong, and one of which is the reason these are in this order, brassica and oat, is that it was pretty much only brassica in the mix, and so I think we lost a little bit of yield out of the deal. But I wanted to show you what they gained. So these are the 2 after wheat. These are after corn silage. This is after alfalfa. And this one I think is after corn silage. So we had 600-pound calves. We put them out in November. We essentially wean them. We get them bunk broke, get them settled down, and then we put them out. And you can see we have kind of a variety of gains, and you might be going, well, what's going on there? The first thing, this might clarify it a little bit. So these are the different years, and this year sticks out, right? Sticks out kind of like a sore thumb. Because these are the same, these mixes, this mix is the same mix. Why did we have a pound a day of difference in gains? These are the same genetics of calves. They were the same size. This year wasn't a cold year. Actually, it was a warmer year than normal. This was actually a colder year. But we had like 6 precipitation events during the winter while they were grazing, and it wasn't frozen. I mean, it was like freezing rain type precipitation. So they had a higher energy requirement because they kept having a wet coat. So the energy went towards maintaining the animal, not towards growing, and that's what we get. The point here is that you're going to get some variable results, but we can get some really good gains. 1.5, 2 pound a day is probably a reasonable estimate. We average across all these 1.9. I do want to show you, so this is the side-by-side comparison of the same fields. We essentially split fields and we grazed multiple fields that had either the oat monoculture versus the oat rapeseed. I have another year over here, it does the exact same thing. 0.2 of a pound a day difference in gain. So that was pretty exciting. All right, so the other way to look at this is how many AUMs did I get? So how many cow months? Does that make sense? If I was to put it on a, in this case, it's actually a 1,000-pound cow, which who has 1,000-pound cows anymore, right? But this would be for a 1,000-pound cow for a month. Per acre, what kind of grazing did we get out of the deal? What we essentially did on all of those is we had the 600-pound calves. We put them out at a calf an acre, essentially, and we grazed until there was no more forage left. And what I mean by no more forage, we really wanted to get off when it had about 3 inches of actual forage left. And there's a couple reasons why we did that. As animal scientists, the main reason is that you start limiting intake at that point. The other one is we want some cover, right? We want to leave some cover. However, I was really shocked. We've been taking erosion measurements on this corn silage ground in particular, and even where they grazed it to the ground, I mean, there's nothing left. That little bit, itty bitty bit of stubble and those roots actually have a huge impact on the erosion potential on corn silage ground. It looks like there's no cover, but even if when we mismanaged it, it still helps a lot with erosion. Now, I don't recommend doing that. Again, that was my mistakes. That was called Christmas break. Right? It was, oh, there's still plenty of forage out there. We're not going to pull them. And then by the time Christmas break is over, there's not enough forage out there. So some of the differences in gain can also be attributed to Mary's mismanagement. But as you can see, we average about 1.4 AUMs per acre. And some years we do much, much better. And it has no correlation with the amount of forage production. Right? This is not the highest productivity in terms of yield. Actually, this was just the best winter in terms of precipitation and freezing. It stayed frozen and we didn't get a lot of precip. We were able to graze like 90 days on the same amount of forage that oftentimes we only get 60 on. It's because we didn't trample in as much. Does that make sense to everybody? Grazing efficiency was really affected. So lesson learned, Mary's lesson learned is that even though it's dead and not growing, allocation can still be beneficial. I thought I had the next slide on here. That actually, we've been doing some work recently where they've been given about a week's worth at a time. And we can double the amount of AUMs we can capture by just giving them a week's worth at a time. You get a wet event, you trample in a week's worth, right? Not the majority of field. So, what would I do? I'd probably change that management now. We're going to do a few more trials so we can show the difference. Okay, across these trials, I just wanted to show you what our costs were per acre. And really, the big thing that's probably jumping out to everybody is those bright green bars. Hopefully, you can see those. Right? If you look at the cost per acre, this is seed cost, this is seeding, and then we have fencing is this next bar up here, right? The very top bar, and it's about $5 an acre. It's what it costs us to fence. That would be a temporary 1-strand fence. But you can see we essentially double our costs if we put on that 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen, which is what we had been doing. And after corn silage, it does not make sense. the growing season is too short for it to take advantage of that nitrogen. All we do is accumulate nitrate in that forage. So I spent a lot of money to artificially inflate my crude protein, right? I get 25 to 28% crude protein, and it's nitrates, and it doesn't really do me any good. So lesson learned, don't do what Mary does. I probably would not fertilize anything other than, I do think on my wheat acres with the earlier planting, I'd still probably put on the 40. You like my, I promise my shoes were clean. But you can see, so our costs range from $26 to $76 an acre. The big cost difference is the fertilizer. This particular one was, both of these mixes were designed by a crops educator, and they really weren't seeded at a high enough rate. That's one of the reasons why the yields were a little lower. We needed a bit more seed per acre. I also probably would have fertilized those. But what was the cost per AUM? So if you took the last slide and this, in the previous slide, and you put them together, what do we get? We get a range of anywhere from 16, this is a really good year, right? To, whoa, what happened here? I should point out, actually this particular year, we had to pull off early because we got an ice event, then we got another ice event, and they couldn't graze, so we pulled them off. So we didn't get to use all the forage. But mean cost, if you put it on a cow day basis, 1.5, so $1.50 a cow day. That's not too bad. If we don't make all Mary's mistakes, I think we can definitely make this cost competitive with about any winter feeding system we have. And we really can make it cost competitive if we look at it on a cost of gain basis, because we're taking advantage of that quality. So right now, feedlot cost of gain, 70 cents is really good. You can see, minus the ones where I put on fertilizer, we're doing pretty good. So I learning a lot. This was also a year I had to pull off a bit early. Okay, so one last thing I wanted to just show you is I've had a few producers who are doing after wheat, and again, they're delaying their planting, and they're planting something that's cool season. This guy in particular, he's actually moisture limited, and they put wheat into their rotation because they're moisture limited. They're about 26 inches, I think, per year. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that oftentimes, if we're doing it for forage, the amount of grass we're going to put in the mix will essentially smother out anything we try as a legume. And so you have a lot of cost in the legume seed, and you don't get a lot of benefit out of it from a forage perspective. I have no clue what's going on with soils. I'm not a soils person. I don't want to try to tackle that question. What I know is if I'm looking for forage, I'm probably not going to do a legume. All right, with that, I'll take any questions. These were just, whoop, my bad. Yes, sir.
So why were you bunk breaking the calves before putting them out on the cover crop?
The big reason is we want to make sure that we are taking care of, they know how to drink water, but also they're going to come back. And for these guys, we all feed them so we get a weight full on a diet that we're going to feed them when they come back, because we want to eliminate fill differences so we actually know what they gain. Because so in calves, or even cows, right, they have this big vat, right, inside of them, this rumen. In a calf, it's probably 30 gallons, all right? If it's full, and let's say it's full of water and forage, I can have a deviation of about 50 pounds, whether it's full or empty. So we are actually mainly doing that from a standpoint of research, that I want to have them eating their full intake, and I want to have them on the same diet when I take away at the beginning and the same diet when I take away at the end. And it makes a huge difference on what you say the gain is. A lot of times I've heard people talk about 3 pound a day gain on some cover crops, and I was like, that's fill, right? So it's a difference in fill. So we didn't want to do that. The other thing is that we often have, at weaning, we sometimes have some issues with them breaking with, say, a respiratory disease or something. We want to make sure that we have that kind of treated and out of them before we turn them out, because we also turn them out into 20-acre paddocks and multiple groups because we're doing research and I have replicates. And the cattle crew already hates me because of that, having to pull a bunch of calves around the paddock. As a management standpoint, I don't think it's necessary. If I was a producer, if you're not going to have issues with disease, there's probably no need to bump break them first. Actually, maybe take the calf pairs out, get them used to it, then pull the calves. That's what I was going to do it. There's a couple reasons why I do that. One is you can teach the calf what to eat, and the other one is, has anybody ever grazed calves on brassicas? What do? Do you have a mix out there? Do they eat the grass first?
Depends.
It always seems like the calves don't know what these things are, and they're like looking at it like, am I supposed to eat that? And it takes them a little while to figure it out. It seems like the cows the first time, they're the same way, but after they've grazed one time on it, then they know, and then they like it, and they'll eat it.
Well, part of the reason I asked is I've seen several pieces of work where they've just ran them through the chute, cows one direction, calves the other direction. These are animals that have been on pasture all summer, managed graze. They're used to being moved, they're used to being handled like this. And across the board, the reports are the calves don't break stride, there's no stress, there's no disease issue. The calves take to it right away, it's no problem. The cow has a far bigger problem with the calf being sorted than the calf does from being separated from mama. And the calves perform extremely well.
It's grazing, they're used to grazing. It's high quality. And so I totally can believe that. We also have, there's 8,000 head that we're weaning, and we're going to bring from multiple barns based off of their genetics.
From barns.
Yeah. So, no, not from cell barns. These would all be from the Meat Animal Research Center. It's just that they have multiple pole barns, each having, a couple 200 to 400 head, and their genetics are distributed across all of these different ones. And so when we want to get one genetic line, so there's always logistics, right?
Your stuff's more complicated.
Well, I don't know about more complicated. It's more fun, right? Okay, is there any other questions? I talked a lot and didn't get a lot.
So your brassica seed, I've heard people going as low as 2 pounds an acre on brassicas because you've got so many seeds per pound to help keep costs down. Are you looking at that as a way to help reduce costs?
Well, see, I actually like the brassicas to reduce cost, but the way I do it is I'm actually cutting back on my grass seed.
Sure.
So then, the more brassica you have in, the lower the cost of your total seed. If you shoot for the same amount of seeds per acre. And so what I typically do is, the easiest way to kind of figure it out is to say, I have this full seed rate. You have a suggestion, right? So I have a suggestion on oats, and it may be 90 pounds an acre is the suggested target seeding rate. And I want to add in brassicas. Well, the full seeding rate on brassica, we'll talk about purple top turnips because they're some really small seed, is 5 pounds an acre. So if I wanted to get to 100% of my seeding rate, I would want to think about those on a percentage basis. So if I took 50% of my 90, did 45, and 50% of my, say, turnip that we're talking about, it'd be 2.5, right? And put them together. Now, on a mix, I probably am going to shoot between 100 and 150 of the full seeding rate on a percentage basis. Probably going to go a little higher than 100. And so actually, the more brassica, the cheaper the seed's going to actually be. But I don't want to get too high. That's what I was saying about I would go over 50%. And what I really mean is 50% of the seeds.
So this is predicated on the original full seeding rate of it, right? You're saying you cut that in half. But do you have any feeling for just number of seeds of the total mix per foot per acre?
Yeah, so actually, a lot of times we've been targeting about 40 seeds per square foot, if you were thinking about it like that. And I think that's a fairly reasonable, There are some exceptions, but I think that's a reasonable target, especially for forage type. But again, that's some of what we've been doing. We've been planting about 40 seeds per square foot, but then you get some really big seeded guys. And like if you're putting corn in the mix or even soybeans, they kind of throw you off on what you're going to do. Because really, you probably end up putting actually less seeds per square foot if you're going to use one of those. But I think for small grains and adding brassicas or even legumes that are not the big seeded ones, I think it's a good target. But it's a lot of, that's the word I want to use for it. There's a lot of scientific guesses in this, and so there's a lot of different philosophies, right? I will tell you that the biggest thing that I see is there's a lot of people, they throw a bunch of things together, and something's going to grow, right? And it's just a matter of trying to figure out how do we make that the most cost effective we possibly can if I'm looking at it from a forage perspective. And to me, I think the more seeds, if you get too many seeds per acre, you're just throwing away money, right? If you get too few, you're throwing away money because you have those other sunk costs. So it's a guess. And I want to preface that as it's a guess. You have a question? Yeah.
Well, I always have a question. The question that went through my mind is that working with some growers in Nebraska, I'm aware that some of them are using 100% brassicas.
Yep. Seed corn.
Seed corn, especially with beef cows.
Yeah, so one of the things about seed corn is they eat the seed corn. So they eat the residue that's left, which helps them out in terms of the NDF. But I actually do suggest to them, they can get by with it for a couple of reasons. One of which is that the cows start eating the corn first. They're eating those brassicas, but they're also eating the corn. The corn usually runs out because it's not a high residue system in seed corn. But they've kind of self-adapted. The other one is that you're not getting the most efficient use, right? They're fairly loose, but it's okay because most of them are putting dry cows out there. So their requirements here, the quality of the stuff's up here. If some of those nutrients end up coming back out the back end, they're just not quite getting as fat as they would. But they are helping themselves out. They are self-adapting. There's actually some data. So sulfur toxicity is, I worked on that, I think in the about 2005 or so. I spent 4 years working on sulfur toxicity in feedlots. Right? A lot of what we've learned about sulfur toxicity in feedlots is all about fiber. Well, 20% fiber is pretty good. It's just that if you automatically change them over to a high sulfur, high concentrate diet, that's when we have corn problems. I think that we get a little buffering out of the corn residue. I still actually try to get them to plant in some annual ryegrass, and we get some really good yields out of it. It's good quality, doesn't add that much cost, and it can be put in those little bitty seeders. Do you know how many people I've gotten to do it? Why? Because I can get through a lot more acres if I just put the brassica in there because it's such low seeding rate.
Thank you for that.
And the only reason the two are doing it is because they're grazing calves. Nobody's going to do it if they're grazing cows, unfortunately.
Mary,
All right, our time's up.
Do you still have time if there's some other question?
Yes, ma'am.
how are the growers dealing with water, getting water out there?
All kinds of different ways. Growers are great because they come up with all kinds of creative methods. The most common one is hauling water for sure. A lot of them are using their pivots because we have pivots. And as long as it's an electric pivot, they can use their pivot and fill up a tank or two. But I would say, and then some of them are actually putting wells down, or putting small pumps down the well. But I would say the majority of them actually are hauling. We haul water at all of ours, actually. We have one person, they pretty much spend all day. We have about 4,000 calves that are out on stocks around the center. And they spend the better part of the day hauling water. So it's not a small expense. Hauling water is very expensive. Most of the guys that I know who are renting land from somebody, let's say stock grazing or cover crops, they also try to find some place where they can get water that's relatively close. And even if they have to haul, they'll have, say, their trailer or their water truck, and they leave it there, and then they only come out in their small rig, right, to go out and actually provide the water. They're not coming all the way from home. I know some guys who actually go into town because it's actually easier to fill up from town because it doesn't take nearly as long, and then they're driving it from town. So there's all kinds of different ways they're going about it, but that's a challenge. It's probably one of our bigger challenges. And some guys say they don't provide water if they're using a lot of brassicas. That probably works until we freeze. I'm not going to recommend it. Water's important.
So cost of providing water was included in your financial analysis?
Yeah,
slide?
so what we charge is, we actually charge about 20 cents per head per day in yardage, and that's to cover water and essentially going out and checking them. Watering is probably the biggest cost that we have, for
So
sure.
what kind of tanks are they using? Are they using floating tanks, or are they just filling them up?
Just filling them up, yep. And letting go. So you may have some of those 1,000-gallon tanks, and you might fill out a couple of those if you have a bunch of cows out there, and you may only be coming once every 2 days. It's definitely not insignificant.
So water being so expensive, producers still feel it's worth, there's an economic advantage.
Yeah,
even
for
if they
sure.
have to haul water.
So for us, I didn't show you guys this, but see, we're in the top 3 states for agricultural land tax. And what that means is our pasture costs are $300 to $400 a cow-calf pair a year. And it's driven by essentially our property taxes. And so when you start putting that out, we're about $1.60 to $1.70 a cow day. And so if you start looking at all these other options, we can get into cheaper opportunities by grazing annual forages on much of our land, especially if they're a cover crop, and we are charging the land cost to the cash crop. That's where it works.
Sure.
Doesn't work so well if you do an annual forage system and have to pay that land cost as well. And then most of them are stocks. Honestly, a lot of what we use is corn residue, and corn residue is by far the cheapest way. We can get to 50 cents per head per day easy, because most people charge like $10 an acre for corn residue. We have an average 175 bushel an acre. That means we can get about 1.75 cow months out of an acre. $10 for 1.7 cow months. That looks pretty doggone good.
So how many people are using, a relationship where I've got the cows, you've got the land, and what kind of those leases look like?
Well, those leases are all over the board. It's all relationship driven. We don't have a lot of what I would consider commodity type system going on. We've tried to help, like connect people, but really it's pretty much just, I know this guy, I like this guy, he's my neighbor, I'm gonna help him out, he's gonna help me out, and we come to some mutual decision. There is not a lot of those landowner or crop person, cattle person that purely looks at it as a business decision. And it's interesting, but it's truly that way. So if you look at what they've negotiated, oftentimes I'm always like, well, if I was, do the math, one of the two is not getting the best deal, right? That it's not the most mutual beneficial, but they're both happy with it. So to me, right? So I would say the majority of them is the crop owner's probably not getting as much out of the forage as he probably could be if you were negotiated based off a forage value basis.
But they must, for some reason,
They
like
see
the
it.
cattle there.
They see it as an offset to their soil benefits, right? It's an offset the cost of planting the cover crop, capturing the soil benefits. And like Matt talked about today, he talked about a lot of the soil organic matter benefits are below the ground. It's all the roots. Grazing doesn't disturb that. And so we can get that win-win, And so I can pay for my cover crop having the cattle use it. And so a lot of them, that's what they're doing. They're having them pay for their seed.
So you heard some Iowa producers respond, they were concerned about liability. These are my cows, now they're on my land.
Yep. So and we don't have it up yet, but we've been working a lot with trying to help develop leasing agreements. That would be an actual written agreement. We love them to have written agreements. And it explicitly says who's liable for what, because that's extremely important. And especially for some of these crop guys who might be willing to do it if they can ensure that they're not going to be held liable for anything. And so I think that's the most important right now. Most of the guys are going to go to a pasture lease agreement and actually modify it. So we've been working on trying to develop a lease agreement. I don't think we have it up on the website yet, but we will before this winter. That would be specifically for crop ground grazing. So it would be either for residue or cover crops. And you can work out a lot of different things, but one of the ways that some of our crop producers, they've made to where you have to have liability insurance, meaning that livestock producer has to have liability insurance that's going to be responsible if anything happens. And I think that's a completely reasonable way to do it. You don't want to, you're getting minimal value out.
Yeah, it's not a huge deal if you're a livestock producer and you're leasing pasture, you're doing it already, so
Yep.
it's not a big deal.
Exactly. So I just think it's a matter of them coming together, having a written agreement, who's responsible for what. And we have, I don't know, I would say probably 20 to 30% of the crop ground grazing that happens where it would be them sending cows and somebody taking care of them for the winter. And see, that's a whole different ball of wax, right? And that might be a middleman. That might be, they're renting the grazing from a crop producer and they're the middleman getting the cattle. And so that's adds a whole nother layer of complexity. But again, having it written out, who's responsible for what, who's liable for what, makes all the difference.
All right, that's time. Let's get married.